Some mornings, the light in Asheville hits the mountains just right, and for a few seconds, you forget that anything in the world could go wrong. I've been watching that light from my kitchen window for 31 years. My wife Dorothy used to say the mountains had their own kind of mercy. She would stand right where I stand now, both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and she'd say, "Howard, no matter what happens today, those hills will still be there tomorrow." She died 4 years ago, and I still talk to the mountains on her behalf. My name is Howard Mercer. I'm 71 years old, and I spent 4 decades as a structural engineer before I retired. I designed bridges, parking structures, and municipal buildings across western North Carolina. The house I live in, however, I built with my own hands. Every joint, every beam, every stone in the fireplace. It took me 3 years of weekends and every vacation day I had. Dorothy packed lunches and handed me tools and argued with me about window placement, and I will tell you right now that she was right about the windows. She was almost always right about everything. My son Nathan is 43. He works in commercial real estate in Charlotte, about 2 hours east. He married Cassandra 11 years ago, and from the first dinner she sat across from me at this table, I knew she saw our family the way a buyer walks through a property. Calculating square footage, estimating value, looking for what could be flipped. I never said that to Nathan. A man only says something like that once to his son, and after that, the son stops calling. I said it once. Nathan stopped calling for almost 8 months. When he called again, it was because Cassandra had softened, he said. She wanted to make things right, he said. I let it go because Nathan is my son, because Dorothy would have wanted me to, and because their daughter Lily had just turned 2 and I wasn't willing to lose her over my own stubbornness. Over the years, the financial requests came the way water comes into an old basement, not in a flood, but in a slow, persistent seep. Nathan's investment into a fitness app, a loan for Cassandra's sister's catering business, help with the down payment on their second car. I gave what I could and said no when I had to, and every time I said no, Cassandra's eyes went flat in a way that made the back of my neck feel cold. My neighbor Frank has lived across the street for 22 years. He's 74, a retired corporate attorney, and he has a vegetable garden that would make a farmer feel inadequate. Frank and Dorothy used to trade tomatoes for squash every August. After she died, he kept leaving vegetables on my porch without being asked, and I kept leaving beer in his mailbox, and neither of us ever mentioned it directly. That's the kind of friendship that doesn't require explanation. About 2 years ago, Frank came over one evening and sat across from me at the kitchen table with the particular expression he used to wear in the courtroom when he was about to say something the other side wasn't going to like. He said, "Howard, I know this isn't my business, but I've been watching how Cassandra talks about this house." He paused. Not the house itself, the value of it. I already knew. I'd been watching the same thing. We talked for 3 hours. By the end of that evening, Frank had drafted the first version of what would become a very careful arrangement. My savings, $400,000 accumulated over a lifetime of working, were divided. A portion went into a trust that Frank managed as trustee, structured so that no power of attorney and no family signature could touch it without a 60-day review period and Frank's direct approval. The remainder went into what I will call, for lack of a better term, the visible account, the one that showed up on statements, the one that looked like everything I had. The house was registered as part of a revocable living trust with a specific provision. Any sale required dual trustee signatures, mine and Frank's. I did not tell Nathan or Cassandra about any of this. Frank installed a small recording device in my home office, the kind that activates on sound and uploads wirelessly to a secure server. We tested it. It worked perfectly. I felt guilty about it sometimes, late at night. Setting a trap for your own family is an ugly thing to sit with, but I kept remembering something Dorothy said near the end of her life. She was practical the way people get when they know time is running short. She took my hand and she said, "Don't let them take the house, Howard. Promise me. You built it. It's yours, I promised her. I intend to keep that promise. Last January, I went in for a procedure I'd been putting off for too long. My cardiologist, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Osei, who has the bedside manner of a chess player, told me I had a significant blockage and needed a bypass. Not optional, she said. Schedule it this week. I called Nathan because he was my emergency contact, because he is my son, and because I still believe in the possibility of people. He drove up the night before the surgery with Cassandra and their twins, Lily and Owen, who are 9 now. Lily drew me a picture of our house in crayon and gave it to me at the hospital. Owen told me he was going to be a doctor so he could fix hearts himself. Cassandra smiled the whole evening in a way that never quite reached her eyes, and she asked me twice whether I'd updated my will recently. I told her I had my affairs in order. She smiled again. The surgery lasted 6 hours. I was told later that everything went well, though well in cardiac surgery means something different than it does in ordinary life. I woke up in recovery not knowing what day it was, not entirely sure where I was, aware only of the noise of machines and a dull weight across my chest that the nurses assured me was normal. I was in the hospital for 9 days. Nathan visited twice. Cassandra came once, on the 4th day, and spent most of the visit on her phone in the hallway. Frank came every single day. He'd bring the newspaper and sit in the chair by the window and read to me when I was too tired to hold the pages myself, and on the 6th day, when I was alert enough to have a real conversation, he set the paper down and looked at me carefully. "Something's happening," he said. "I don't want to alarm you, but you should know." He told me that 2 days after my surgery, while I was still in the ICU, a man had come to my house with Cassandra. Frank had seen them from his window. They were inside for about 40 minutes. Frank had checked the recording server that evening. The audio was clear. Cassandra had walked the man through every room, describing square footage and lot size and the seller's situation, meaning my situation. The man was a real estate agent. 2 days after that, Frank received an automated alert from the bank. Someone had submitted a power of attorney document and requested a wire transfer from my visible account. The bank had flagged it because the POA document had an inconsistency in the notary seal, and they'd put a 72-hour hold on the transaction while they verified. Frank had already contacted the bank's fraud department by the time he told me. I lay in that hospital bed with wires on my chest and a tube in my arm, and I felt something go very still inside me. Not rage, exactly. More like the feeling you get when something you've been dreading for a long time finally arrives and you realize you've been ready for it longer than you knew. "The POA," I said. "Did I ever sign one?" "No," Frank said. "You never signed one." I asked him to call Detective Ramirez at the Asheville Police Department. Frank already had her number from his previous career. He'd called her the night before. Nathan called me on the morning of my 8th day in the hospital. His voice had that particular quality it gets when he's doing something Cassandra wants him to do. A little too steady, a little too rehearsed. He said he wanted to talk about my living situation when I got home. He said the house was a lot for one person to manage. He said he and Cassandra had looked into some really excellent continuing care communities in the area, places with full nursing staff and social activities. "Very comfortable," he said. "Really first class." I let him talk. I've learned, at 71, that there is power in silence. When he finished, I said, "Nathan, why did Cassandra meet with a real estate agent at my house while I was in surgery?" There was a pause long enough to park a car in. "She was just getting information," he said finally. "Being proactive, in case you needed to move." "In case I needed to move," I repeated. "While I was in surgery, Dad." "There's also the matter of the power of attorney document submitted to my bank," I said. "The one I never signed. The one with the fraudulent notary seal." The silence this time was different. It had a texture to it. "I don't know anything about that," Nathan said. But his voice had lost the rehearsed quality entirely. He sounded like my son again, which was almost worse. "I hope that's true," I said. I genuinely hope that's true. But I want you to know that Detective Ramirez at the Asheville PD is currently reviewing the recording from the device in my home office. And the bank has the fraudulent POA document with Cassandra's signature on it as the requesting party. I paused. Give your sister a hug for me. Tell Owen I expect a full cardiac report when I get home. I hung up. My hands were shaking, and I'm not sure if it was the surgery or the conversation or the simple grief of it. I sat looking at the window for a long time. The hospital faced east, and I could see the edge of the Blue Ridge in the distance, dark and patient and enormous. Dorothy's Mountains, still there. Frank was in the chair by the window. He hadn't left. She signed it herself, I said. Not a question. The bank's fraud analyst thinks so, he said. The notary stamp belongs to a notary in Charlotte who has no record of the transaction. We'll know more when the detective finishes her work. And my house? The agent she brought in? No listing has gone up yet. The trust documentation makes it impossible to list without your signature and mine. Any agent who tries will have a very bad time of it legally. Frank said this with a quiet satisfaction that reminded me why I'd always respected him. I was discharged 2 days later. Frank drove me home. When we pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment and just looked at the house. The stone facade I had laid one piece at a time. The porch Dorothy had planted with roses every spring since the first year we moved in. The roses were dormant now in January, cut back to their woody canes, but they'd bloom again. They always did. Inside, the house was exactly as I'd left it. Dorothy's clock on the mantel, my engineering books along the wall, the kitchen table where we'd eaten 30 years of meals. Nothing had been disturbed, though I noticed immediately that the small silver box on my office desk, where I kept a spare key and some documents, had been moved slightly. Whoever had been in this office had been careful, but not careful enough. The recording had caught everything. Detective Ramirez came to the house the following afternoon. She was methodical and unhurried, the kind of investigator who makes you feel she's already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. She reviewed the audio file on Frank's laptop, listened to the full 40 minutes of Cassandra walking the agent through my house, heard the part where Cassandra said, "He won't be coming home the same as he left. He's going to need a facility, and the family will need to liquidate. We want to move quickly." Ramirez wrote in her notebook without any visible reaction. She told me the fraudulent POA was enough, combined with the audio, to pursue charges for fraud and attempted theft by deception. She asked if I wanted to proceed. This is the part that people who haven't been through something like this don't understand. It's not a simple question. On one side is the law, which is clear. On the other side is 22 years of watching your son grow from a boy who built model planes on the living room floor into a man you're not entirely sure you recognize anymore. You think about Lily drawing pictures of your house in crayon. You think about Owen wanting to fix hearts. I told Detective Ramirez to proceed with the charges against Cassandra. I told her I needed to speak with Nathan directly before deciding how to handle his involvement. Nathan arrived the next morning. He came alone. He looked like he hadn't slept, and when I opened the door, he stood on my porch for a moment without speaking, and I saw on his face something I hadn't seen there in years, something honest. We sat at the kitchen table. I made coffee because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. He told me that Cassandra had presented the plan to him as a practical solution, that she'd told him the POA was legal, that she'd handled the paperwork correctly, that it was what people did when an elderly parent couldn't manage their own affairs. He said he'd believed her because he'd wanted to, because it was easier than asking the right questions. I knew something was wrong, he said quietly. I think I knew. He stopped, looked down at his coffee. You wanted to believe she was doing it for the right reasons, I said. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. I told Nathan that Cassandra would be charged. I told him that I would speak on his behalf and describe his cooperation honestly, and that what happened after that was between him and the law and whatever he decided to do with his own conscience. I told him that I loved him. I told him that would not change. What I did not tell him was that I had already revised my will 6 months earlier. The house and whatever remained of my estate would go into a trust for Lily and Owen, accessible when they turned 25, managed by Frank. Nathan and Cassandra would receive nothing. I didn't tell him because it wasn't cruelty he needed from me in that moment. It was clarity. He left an hour later. At the door, he turned around and said, "Dad, I'm sorry." Just that. I nodded. Some things don't have better words than those, even when the words aren't quite enough. Cassandra was formally charged 3 weeks later with fraud, forgery of a legal document, and attempted theft. Her attorney worked to negotiate a plea. I was told she would likely avoid prison time with full restitution and probation, given that the fraud had been caught before the transfer completed. Some people thought that wasn't enough. Frank thought the system had worked about as well as it usually does, which is to say, imperfectly but adequately. I thought about what Dorothy would have said. Probably something about not wasting good anger on a bad situation. Probably something practical. The real estate agent Cassandra had brought to my house sent me an apologetic letter when the story became clear. He said he'd had no idea the property wasn't being listed with the owner's knowledge. I believed him. I wrote back and told him so. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. I continued my recovery. Frank came over for coffee most mornings. I started working with a physical therapist named Marcus, who is relentlessly cheerful in a way that I initially found irritating and eventually found essential. My heart healed the way the doctors said it would, slowly and then faster than slowly, and by April I could walk the block without stopping. In April, the roses came back. I had been thinking about the house for some time, not in Cassandra's way, not as a number or a transaction, but honestly, the house was 4 bedrooms. It was 3 stories, counting the walk-up attic where I kept my drafting table and old project files. I was one person, recovering from surgery, spending most of my time in the kitchen and the office and the porch. The house was right for the life Dorothy and I had built together. I wasn't sure it was right for the life I was building now. There was a young couple who had moved in 2 doors down the previous fall. Brendan and Sasha, both in their early 30s, both teachers at the local middle school. They had a little girl named Clara who was not yet 2 and who had recently discovered the particular joy of walking down driveways and attempting to continue indefinitely into the street, which required constant vigilance. I'd talked to them over the fence enough to know they were the kind of people Dorothy would have liked immediately. One afternoon in April, Sasha knocked on my door and asked if she could see my roses because she was thinking about planting some and wanted to know what varieties did well in the mountain climate. I showed her around the garden. She asked questions I could tell she'd actually thought about. Clara toddled alongside us and tried to eat mulch twice. After Sasha left, I stood on the porch for a long time looking at the house. At the stone facade and the wide porch and the east-facing windows Dorothy had been right about. At the garden that needed someone who would actually tend it. At the 4 bedrooms that no one was sleeping in. I called Frank that evening. He came over and we sat on the porch with iced tea and he listened while I thought out loud for about 20 minutes. And at the end he said, "You've already decided." He wasn't asking. I had. I spoke to Brendan and Sasha the following week. I told them I was thinking about selling and I wanted to talk to them first before I listed it anywhere. I saw Sasha reach for Brendan's hand without looking at him. I told them the price I had in mind, which was fair and slightly below what the market would bear. And Brendan said, "Mr. Mercer, are you sure?" And I told him I'd built the house myself and I wanted it to go to people who would understand what that meant. They were sure. I was sure. Frank handled the paperwork personally. Every signature was witnessed, notarized, and documented beyond any possibility of dispute. We closed in June. On the morning of closing, I walked through every room one more time. I took my time. The kitchen where Dorothy made coffee and watched the mountains. The living room with the fireplace I'd built from river stone. Nathan's old room, which had become a guest room, which had become a room full of boxes I kept meaning to sort through. My office, with the drafting table, that had been in every home I'd ever lived in. In each room I stopped and said something to Dorothy. I don't know exactly what. It wasn't for anyone else to hear. I had found a smaller place about 15 minutes outside town, a craftsman cottage, which felt appropriate, with a workshop in the converted garage and a back porch that faces west. No mountains to speak of in the immediate view, just trees and a creek that runs through the property and makes a sound at night that I have decided is one of the better sounds in the world. The yard is manageable. The rooms are the right number of rooms for one person who reads a great deal and occasionally has his neighbor over for dinner. On moving day, Frank helped me load the last of the boxes. Brendan and Sasha arrived with Clara just as we were finishing, and Clara immediately began investigating every empty corner with great seriousness. Sasha told me the roses were going to be her personal responsibility. Brendan shook my hand and held on to it for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and I understood that he knew what I was giving him. Before I got in the car, I stood in the driveway and looked at the house one last time. 31 years. The life Dorothy and I had made. The argument about the windows we'd had 46 times and that she'd been right about every single time. The winter Nathan broke his collarbone sledding in the backyard. The summer evenings on the porch when the fireflies came up from the grass and Dorothy would count them like she was keeping score against the dark. I took a breath of mountain air and got in the car. Frank drove. We didn't talk much on the way out of town, which is one of the things I appreciate about Frank. He knows when words are adequate and when they're not. About a mile down the road, he said, Dorothy would say you made the right call. Dorothy would say I took too long getting there, I said. Frank laughed. Also true. I've been in the cottage for 2 months now. I've set up the drafting table in the workshop and I've started sketching again, not for clients, just for myself. Small structures. A garden shed with a particular kind of roof joint I've always wanted to try. A footbridge design for the creek. My hands remember what they know. Lily and Owen have visited twice. Nathan brought them, which tells me something about where he is in his own process of figuring things out. We don't talk about Cassandra. We talk about what the twins are learning in school and what I'm building in the workshop and whether Owen still wants to be a doctor. He does. He's narrowed it down to either cardiology or marine biology, which tells you everything you need to know about the mind of a 9-year-old. Nathan and I are not where we were before all of this. I'm not sure we'll get back to that place entirely, and I've stopped deciding in advance whether that's a tragedy or just the shape that certain relationships take when enough truth passes through them. What I know is that when he dropped the twins off last month, he stood in the doorway of the workshop and watched me work for a while, and he said, "You always made things look easier than they are." And I said, "That's because I practiced." And he nodded like that meant something to both of us. It did. Some mornings now I sit on the west-facing porch with my coffee and listen to the creek and think about what Dorothy said about the mountains having their own kind of mercy. I think maybe it's not just the mountains. I think mercy has a way of finding you in the geography you end up in, whatever that geography turns out to be. You just have to stay open to where it's coming from. The roses at the old house bloomed again in May. Sasha sent me a photograph. They were extraordinary. I wrote back and told her they'd been extraordinary every year for 30 years, and they would keep being extraordinary as long as someone paid attention to them. That's all anything needs, really. Just someone paying attention. I'm still here. My heart is working. The creek is doing what creeks do. Frank is coming for dinner Thursday, and I'm making the chicken piccata that Dorothy taught me, which I've been getting incrementally better at for 27 years. The workshop is full of sawdust and good plans. It turns out that at 71, after everything, a life can still be built. You just have to decide to keep building it.